One of the more frequent questions I get is, how did you become interested in the field of esotericism? Of course, there are actually lots of ways I could answer that question, from television shows about mysterious topics growing up, to a general sense of the surreal oddness of the world, to just the accident of whatever makes people interested in anything ultimately. However, a few decisive memories do stand out. One of those was reading Edgar Allan Poe's 1839 short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, in middle school, specifically reading one passage about the habits of Robert Usher in his reading. There we learn how the rapidly declining mental, physical, and spiritual health of Usher is reflected in his odd literary tastes. The volumes are connected with otherworldly voyages, the realms of the angelic and especially the demonic, subterranean spirituality barely recalled. Importantly, we learn that, quote, one favorite volume was a small octavo edition of the Directorium Inquisitorum by the Dominican Emeric de Giron. I recall the Latin titles and hints of obscure metaphysics simultaneously inspired in me a sense of wonder, dread, and overwhelming fascination. What were these books? What kind of knowledge did they contain? Could they really induce or reflect the conditions suffered by Usher? Could texts really exist at the limits of sanity and blasphemy? That one volume, Directorium Inquisitorum, was especially disquieting. Even as a young person, I had a vague but horrible idea about the Inquisition. Black-robed torturers gibbering Latin in the bowels of some medieval dungeon. It was part D&D and part Hammer House horror films and part heavy metal record covers, but not much actual history. Over the years, I still kept the D&D and the heavy metal, but have since added a little bit more actual history to that image. And it's texts like the Directorium Inquisitorum that I want to turn in this series on the history and development of demonological literature. Now, I know this term is a bit confusing. I'm referring to the Christian literature that deals specifically with the interplay of human beings and the forces of metaphysical evil. Typically those are fallen angels or demons led by Satan in that specific form of the mythology. More specifically, this series will trace the theoretical developments that underwrote the witch trials of early modern Europe. Now, as you can imagine, the outbreak of mass murder killing between 40 and 60,000 people, mostly women of course, in this period between roughly 1450 and 1650 didn't happen spontaneously. Rather, it was a result of many forces, some of which were developments in the theological and juridical understandings of the relationship between human beings and the forces of evil in this world. This series explores some, though not all, of these developments. In this first episode, I'm going to explore the period prior to the publication of the monumental 1486 Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. The second episode will cover that text and similar subsequent and actually more influential volumes. And the third episode will cover the skeptical reaction to the work of all these demonologists. If you're interested in the history of magic, demonology, or the occult more generally, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other content on just these topics. Also, you might consider supporting my work of making scholarly, accessible, and free content on these topics on YouTube by becoming a supporter on Patreon or with a one-time donation. You can find those links below in the description. So I hope you'll join me as I explore some of the foundational demonological texts of the Middle Ages. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. From its earliest documents, Christianity has understood itself to be engaged in a titanic struggle between the forces of divine goodness and those of satanic evil. The most consistent miracle attributed to Jesus was that of exorcisms, or the driving out of evil spirits, and the New Testament itself reaches its crescendo in the final battle of Armageddon, where the forces of evil are finally defeated, forever. For early Christianity, the forces of evil were powerful, ever-present, and intensely threatening. From the spiritual battles of the Desert Fathers in Egypt to the juridical nightmare of the early modern witch trials, Christianity has long understood itself as the great fulcrum in the war between good and evil. Augustine, perhaps more than any other early Christian, drew those battle lines the sharpest. For him, there was to be a clear line between pagan and Christian, Orthodox believer and heretic. Since God was taken to be the sole and effective sovereign power in the universe, any attempt by human beings to interact with beings aside from God via the church was an implicit rejection of divine sovereignty. This, of course, would include any form of magic, which, for Augustine, was actually effectuated by demons in order to trick the magician so as to basically jeopardize their very soul. The magician, thinking that they were wielding magical powers, was actually always already just a helpless pawn. Importantly, Augustine also condemned good magic, or theurgy, whereby one invokes beneficent angels or the divine itself. Here, Augustine claims that demons simply transform themselves into angels of light. This is, of course, paraphrasing the Apostle Paul, thereby fooling the theurgist perhaps even more sorely than the necromancer. In this line of thinking, salvific and miraculous power were the exclusive prerogative of God, of course as mediated by the Church, and any deviation veered inevitably into the clutches of Satan. Now, there is also a parallel discussion we could be having about the relationship of Christianity to magic more generally. I've actually done an episode on both the practice of Christian magic in ancient Coptic Egypt and on the development of scholarly attitudes about magic by learned Christians, mostly through the Middle Ages. You can find both those episodes in the cards above. Of course, it took centuries for Christianity to work out and then systematize its incredibly complex theology and, by extension, its internal legal system, a process that's actually still going on today. Europe's longest continuously functioning university, the University of Bologna, founded in the 11th century, was instrumental in the development of the canon law that governed the church, but also set the groundwork for later secular legal systems as well. Among the earliest systematic texts of canon law is the incredibly important Decretum of Gratian, compiled and written in the mid-12th century. For this study, the most important section of that rather massive text is the so-called Canon Episcopi, founded at Causa 26, Quaestio 5, Canon 12. This text predates the Decretum by centuries. In fact, it's first attested around 906 of the Common Era, and it probably reflects the attitudes of the period just after the conversion of the Franks from paganism and the very early years of the Holy Roman Empire. Thus, it's an important window onto the pagan, pre-Christian world of that time. The text urges local bishops to eradicate the practice of magic and divination from the recently converted population. However, this is to be accomplished not by torturing or killing people, but by expelling those people from their parishes. And it is only after repeated admonitions against such practices that a person can actually be deemed a heretic and thus expelled. That designation of heretic is going to prove incredibly important later on, so hold on to it. This text also discusses the idea that certain women believe that they ride beasts with Diana to join in collective worship of this pagan goddess. Of course, this is one of the earliest mentions of something like the flight to the witch's sabbat. Though notice here that neither is flight mentioned, they ride upon beasts, nor is the devil there traveling with the goddess Diana or a similar local pagan deity. Further, and this is really crucial, the Canon Episcopi makes it clear that the journey to worship Diana is a, quote, phantasm imposed upon the mind by demonic forces, and that the women do not, in fact, physically travel anywhere. The travel upon the beasts and the collective worship of Diana is a demonic delusion and not actual geographic travel. Further in this text, there's also a condemnation of shape-shifting. This is perhaps reflecting a pagan belief of transforming into animals or perhaps other shamanic practices of this period. Indeed, we read that the person that believes in such shape-shifting practices is, quote, procul dubio infidelis et pagano deterior. They're beyond doubt an infidel and worse than a pagan. This intense condemnation reflects two concerns. The first is philosophical. God has made the various metaphysical categories of the world, and attempting to cross those barriers is a violation of both physical and metaphysical law. Second, such shape-shifting was also likely a key feature of pre-Christian religion, and thus had to be so forcefully condemned by the church at this time. While the issue of shape-shifting largely fades into the background as Christianity gains hegemony, the question of women magically traveling to nocturnal meetings is going to take on a life of its own. It's going to become the backbone of the witch legend. However, the canon's dismissal of the idea of actual travel is going to prove to be a difficult hurdle for later demonologists to cross. Of course, they're going to have to insist on the reality of the flight to the Sabbat, and given that the Canon Episcopi would have been considered canon law, settled law at that time, we're going to have to see just how they argued against this position. They're going to have to overturn the Canon Episcopi, and that won't be easy. In this discussion, St. Thomas Aquinas doesn't really prove to be terribly influential, which is surprising given that he's utterly influential in every other regard vis-a-vis the Catholic Church. What is perhaps most interesting is his attempt to logically deduce that demonic intelligences alone can be responsible for the magic of the sorcerers in Summa Contra Gentiles 3, section 2. For Thomas, the incantations of the sorcerers can't have direct effects upon nature because nature lacks the very intellectual capacity to respond to speech. Thus, there must be another efficient cause to short the circuit between the sorcerer and the nature that was to be manipulated. Of course, the efficient cause here, the middleman or middle demon, are just those. They're invisible demons. Thomas extends this entire form of thinking to amulets, magical symbols, and other things. It's only through the intelligences of the demons that magic is actually effectuated. Not much is really added here. Thomas basically provides an Aristotelian argument for the position pretty much offered up in Augustine. However, this will prove grist for the mill of many later demonologists, and Thomas's condemnation of magic along these logical lines is actually quoted several times in the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, perhaps the most famous of all demonological texts. Among the earliest signs of what was to come was the 1324 trial of Dame Alice Kittler by an ecclesiastical court in Ireland. Now, this case is rather complex, and summarizing it is pretty difficult. However, Kittler was a wealthy woman whose reputation was tarnished by allegations of having murdered a previous husband, or two, or three, or four, and made worse by the fact that she engaged in the ever-popular hobby of moneylending. Now, it's worth pointing out at this point that virtually all sorcery trials of this period prior to around 1450 were made against relatively high-ranking people, often with political motivations, unlike the later trials, which are aimed largely at lower-class peasant women. Well, after her fourth husband fell ill and then expressed that he was being poisoned by Kittler and then died, the children of the previous four dead husbands accused her of sorcery. Now, the link between poisoning and witchcraft, or maleficium, was long established, with even the Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible rendering machashefa, or female evil magic doer. This is a word well attested as such in languages like Akkadian as pharmakus, or poisoner, in a general trend that's kind of rationalizing throughout the entire Septuagint. They even translate a Hebrew word for necromancer, Baal Ov, as ventriloquist, or literally belly talker. At any rate, Kittler is eventually accused of a range of diabolical crimes, including rejecting Christianity, of course, sacrificing animals to demons at a crossroads, holding nocturnal meetings to perform black magic and, well, destroy Christianity, using sorcery to manipulate other Christians, having a specific demon helper and incubus lover named Robin, son of Art, and, of course, killing her husbands. What's surprising about this case, perhaps, is that the local bishop, because of the unsettled relationship between sacred and secular law, and Kittler's position in high society, had a pretty difficult time even having her arrested. In fact, he was even arrested at one point in the whole affair. Even the negotiations for her surrender eventually allowed her the chance to escape, and she basically vanishes out of history. I don't blame her. Sadly, however, Kittler's maidservant, Petronia de Meath, was actually arrested, tortured, and confessed to a wide range of crimes. She was eventually flogged and burned to death on the 3rd of November, 1324. And this, of course, foreshadows the mass murder of working class and peasant women to unfold in the centuries that followed. A few things are important about this case. The first is that the relationship between secular and sacred law was still being sorted out at this time. Indeed, this case would set a substantial precedent in kind of ironing out that relationship and making such future prosecutions easier. Secondly, much of the witch stereotype appears already in this case. Curiously enough, the origins of much of this stereotype are actually based on earlier tropes about pagans and Jews used by Christians, such as lurid orgies or idol worship. And even the term Sabbat is basically part of a long-standing anti-Semitic conspiracy theory like the blood libel. They even stem from anti-Christian legends from the Romans of all people. You'll perhaps remember that the Romans accused the early Christians of gathering by night in tombs to, well, consume the dead. Again, this is a shockingly ironic situation. Roman slurs against Christians are being repurposed for Christians to use against witches. Talk about a cycle of violence. Such tropes would now be reconsolidated, mixed with developments in canon law, and then deployed in one unit. The notion of the witch was now slowly coming into existence by the early 14th century. The execution of de Meath in 1324 was mirrored by the composition of the Practica Inquisitionis Heretica Pravitatis, or the practice of the Inquisition of the heretical depravity, by Bernard Guy, who actually also appears as a character in Umberto Eco's 1980 novel The Name of the Rose. Though he's come to be known as a rather cruel inquisitor, I think mostly from the novel, the history is rather mixed in fact. Indeed, he's one of the really extraordinary people in the Middle Ages for reasons both good and ill. Yeah, Bernard Guy, I'm talking about that time that you burned the Talmud in Toulouse. Not cool, man, not cool. Regardless, Guy is important in our discussion for some of the earliest linking of ritual magic with heresy. It's in his text, the Practica, that we get some of the most vivid depictions of necromantic practice from this period. But it's in his depiction of the folk magic of the region around Toulouse and his connecting of that magic with clerical necromancy and thus heresy that's so crucial. While Guy never describes the witch trope in any detail, that he links ritual and folk magic under the rubric of prosecutable heresy and not just sin, that's going to have substantial ramifications in the time to come. However, it would be another Dominican. Yes, the heavy lifting in all this is being performed basically by the Dominicans, though The Jesuits will get in on the game later. I'm looking at you, Martin Del Rio. We'll get to you next time. While the Kittler case is important in this story, another theological and juridical development also proved decisive. And here we return to that text mentioned by Edgar Allan Poe in The Fall of the House of Usher, the 1376 Directorium Inquisitorum by the Spanish Inquisitor Nicholas Emmerich. As you might gather, this text is a manual to be used by the Inquisition to root out and destroy heresy. Of course, the primary target of a text like this would have been relapsed or false converts to Christianity, especially converso Jews, but also the remains of quasi-paganism or the so-called Albigensians. However, it's in his discussion of the particular sins of blasphemy and heresy, the really fun ones, that a crucially important development happens. Generally speaking, up till this point, the practitioner of magic was simply guilty of that particular sin. It was a sin among lots of other sins like lust or gluttony, and it wasn't especially egregious, much less the target of the Inquisition. Again, remember that the task of the Inquisition was to root out heresy, not sin more generally. Emmerich, however, introduces the idea that if a person were to summon and make sacrifices to a demon, that person so violates the first commandment that they are, in fact, a blasphemer and a heretic, and thus a target for the Inquisition. In that case, they can be turned over to the secular authorities for juridical torture and subject to, well, capital punishment by burning or something. This shift in thinking, where the sin of magic can be converted into the crime of heresy, is incredibly crucial in the development for the witchcraft prosecutions that are come later. The witch, as we'll see later, isn't just a sinner. Everybody's a sinner. That's no big whoop. It's that the witch is actually part of an organized heresy seeking to overthrow Christendom by gaining magical powers via a pact with the devil. Really gets out of control. It's in fact very much like a conspiracy theory. Emmerich's linking of magic with heresy is a decisively important development of that theological and juridical framework, though there is more irony here. While the Inquisition was certainly brutal, it was also a very careful and very thick bureaucracy. The upshot was that accusations taken up by the Inquisition, for instance in Spain, were much more carefully adjudicated than accusations made, for instance, in the rural courts of Germany, thus resulting in much fewer execution of so-called witches during the height of the trial. While initial accusation rates were basically similar to other regions like Scotland, the actual execution rate was substantially lower in trials held over by the Inquisition. Like in many regions, there was basically an inverse relationship between a robust juridical layer, especially at the appellate level, that really matters, and the absolute number of people actually executed for witchcraft. Like in many regions, there was an inverse relationship between a robust judicial layer, especially when it came to appellate courts, and the absolute number of people actually executed for witchcraft. It turns out that critical thinking is something of an antidote to conspiracy theories. Despite what you may believe, early universities were actually hotbeds of controversy, especially along theological lines. By the end of the 14th century, it appears that the practice of ritual or ceremonial magic was pretty popular at the University of Paris. Of course, that university had a reputation for, let's call it avant-garde theology. The condemnation of 1277 had attempted to root out the radical Averroist, folks like Siger of Brabant, who may have even rejected the idea of the existence of individual souls and affirmed the heretical Aristotelian concept that the world was in fact eternal. Unsurprisingly, nestled between the radical Averroist and the bawdy Goliard poets, we also find a solid stock of necromancers. Of course, magical texts in both the Solomonic and astral traditions, such as the Picatrix, would have been fixtures of this kind of magical practice. Those sorcerers found themselves, they were condemned in a detailed document of 1398. I mean, are you really surprised they're necromancers at the University of Paris? Yeah, they got condemned in 1398. This text carefully argued that, well, summoning demons and commanding them was heresy because it employs the trappings of Christian piety, such as fasting, prayer, the Mass, sexual abstinence, etc., as a means to gain control over demonic forces, well, the sworn enemies of God and the Church. The rituals to summon and bind those demons are tantamount to worshiping them according to this document, and of course, well, that's blasphemy. What's really fascinating about this short document of about 28 articles is that we get a laundry list of the various occult theories and practices of university necromancy at the turn of the 14th century. It's like a peek into their necromantic world. It's also worth mentioning here that while maleficia, the term typically translated as witchcraft, is mentioned at the start of this text, the target of the condemnation are largely the educated, basically all elite male members of the university. However, this document is a really crucial and important window into the world of learned necromancy of this period and the solidification of the link between magic, blasphemy, and most importantly, heresy during this time period. Now, you might be asking, why aren't we talking about the prosecutions of those university necromancers? Well, they just didn't seem to happen that much, and when they did, they were often more for politically motivated reasons than theological reasons. For instance, the astral necromancy taught by Cecco d'Ascoli would eventually get him prosecuted for heresy, but it's likely that political motivations behind the scenes actually tipped the scales in favor of his guilty verdict and eventually his execution. What's often shocking about this period of the witch trials is that while peasant women were being executed by the thousands, often with confessions extracted by torture being basically the only evidence against them, learned occultists continued publishing texts on Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, magic, etc. The period of the witch trials in the period of Pico, Ficino, Bruno, yeah, he did get burned, but that's a whole different matter, Trithemius Agrippa, John Dee, etc., they all overlap with trials. And while all of these men lived under some suspicion and danger despite there being ample evidence of their heterodox belief and practices, the difference was that they were, perhaps, thought to be sinners, but not part of the so-called witch cult that sought to destroy all of Christendom. The crime of being a witch during the period of the trials was a very specific theological juridical category. It was a crimum exceptum, or an exceptional crime, akin to religious and political treason. And you can see, this concept took centuries to develop and unleash. The last document I'll explore in this episode is probably the most important pre-Malleus Maleficarum demonological text, the 1434 Formicarius, or the Anthill of Johannes Nider, also a Dominican lecturer who was actually involved in the debates with the followers of Jan Hus. Oh yeah, it's another Dominican. Again, basically all of these guys were Dominicans. And all of this actually links up with what is called the Latin polemical tradition, in which Dominicans played a really crucial part. Sadly, I don't have a ton of time to go into this right now, but my colleague Dan Atrell, aka the Modern Hermeticist, is actually working really closely on this material, and he's actually made a video about the Latin polemical tradition that I'll link in the card above. At any rate, the Formicarius takes the form of a dialogue between a teacher and his lazy student. In Book 5 of this pretty massive tome, Nider recounts several recent instances of witchcraft that have been prosecuted early in the 15th century. These are specifically those in the Sim Valley between 1392 and 1406. Indeed, those very prosecutions are now recognized as the earliest witch trials in Europe. While the accounts are interesting in themselves, we get magic lizards and the killing of various kinds of babies, both unborn babies and the born babies are sometimes made into various kinds of potions and unguents. There's, of course, the secret Sabbath meetings focused on a demon in human form, the rejection of Christianity, typical stuff. Though note that Nider actually continues the tradition of rejecting the reality of the night flight as a delusion. What is crucial in Nider's account is his affirmation of previous rumors by people like Pope Alexander V and Eugenius IV that the early 15th century saw the appearance of a, quote, new heretical sect in Europe using magical powers acquired via pacts, with the devil hell-bent on destroying all of Christendom from the inside. This is something like a spiritual fifth column. After his discussion of Joan of Arc, Nider also crucially includes a discussion that feminine weakness inclines them more to this specific temptation, and thus introduces a very solidly misogynistic bent to all this as well. This misogynistic element, of course, would be greatly expanded in texts like the Malleus Maleficarum. By 1440, Alonso Tostado in De Maleficis Mulieribus would be among the first theologians to argue that the night flight was in fact real, attempting to counter the long-established canon episcopi. With the actuality of the night flight comes the actuality of the Sabbat, comes the actuality of the vast satanic conspiracy. The appearance of this new heretical sect in the minds of popes and in the tomes of theologians and jurists and in the confessions arrived at by torture would come together as the witch trials were to be unleashed upon the people, really the women of the entire European sphere, from the New World to Iceland to the heartlands of Germany, where more than half of the victims of this mass murder were killed, all the way to the gates of Moscow, where, like in Iceland, mostly men would be prosecuted. Why mostly men in those places? Well, late conversion to Christianity probably meant surviving pagan practices, perhaps shamanic in character, which the trials would in fact largely suppress. Though in places like Lithuania, conversion was an even later affair, not officially completed until the early 15th century, and pagan survival substantially endured there. In fact, Christianity in Lithuania sometimes looks kind of pagan. In the next episode in this series, I'll turn to the demonologists of the witch trial period proper, from the infamous witch hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, and the encyclopedic discussions of the occult and the writings of Martin del Rio. Then I'll turn in the third episode to the skeptical reaction in the legal, theological, scientific, and philosophical world of the 16th and 17th centuries. Make sure to check back for those episodes as I get them finished. If you're interested in pursuing these texts and thinkers in more depth, the two best places to start are Levak's The Witchcraft Sourcebook and the Coors and Peters Documentary History of Witchcraft. Both of these volumes are superb, really good, and contain reliable translations and commentaries of the most important parts of the text mentioned in this episode. Sadly, texts like the Directorium Inquisitorum and the Formicarius have not received English translations or really even modern Latin editions. But this isn't entirely surprising considering that both are massive tomes. They easily exceed 800 pages in their original editions. However, if you're curious, I have provided links below in the description to online scans of the texts in the original Latin, so you can kind of flip through them and look at the sections on witchcraft and magic. They're typically pretty easy to find with a little cross-referencing, and the Latin, all things told, isn't all that difficult. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and you've been watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane side of history, philosophy, and religion.